So there was this father who was fixing pancakes on a Saturday morning for his two sons, who were 5 and 3. And the boys began to argue over who would get the first pancake. So their father had an idea. He thought it was an opportunity to teach them a lesson. He said, if Jesus were here, he would say, "Let my brother have the first pancake. I'll wait." And so the 5-year-old picked up on that right away and pointed his finger at the 3-year-old and said, "You can be Jesus." Being a faithful Christian does not always come naturally. Taking one's seat at the end of the table and waiting to be invited up, turning the other cheek, remaining silent in front of your accusers, forgiving your enemies, sharing your wealth, welcoming the stranger, loving your neighbor as yourself. Many might say that Christian living needs to come from carefully cultivated habits, cultivated by us not out of fear of some final retribution, nor out of some moral obligation, but cultivated in lives and communities where living for the sake of God and others has brought a depth and a joy and a wonder to life. But as the joke alludes to, following Jesus might mean you miss out on the first pancakes. And, you know, the opportunity to pull rank and assign roles to get in the front of the line, well, that's all too tempting for most of us. So today, from our first 2 lessons especially, we have heard that the subject really is not about pancakes, it's about wealth, the accumulation of which has been tempting to human beings in every generation. Now, liberation theologians working and writing in the latter part of the 20th century, especially in Latin America and Africa, were keen to offer their critique of the narrow way that the church had been parsing Scripture for centuries, particularly the Gospels. In some cases, the way they had been parsing Scripture since Christianity became the religion of the realm in the Roman Empire in 313 AD. Rather than reading the stories in their original contexts, you know, from the perspective of the early Christian community, they were outliers. They were often persecuted. They were living on the fringe of a dominant power grid. In other words, rather than living from the perspective of the poor and needy, rather than looking at Scripture through that lens, the church often has veered in another way. You know, the perspectives that we bring to our encounters with others, and even our Scripture reading, it really matters. It's important that we explore and understand who we are, where we come from, how we live vis-a-vis the rest of the world. It's important that we be clear about the privileges that we enjoy. Many years ago in Haiti, I was with a group of young people. It was a mixed group of Haitian and American youth who were having dinner together, which by any Haitian standard, it was a very fancy dinner, and by our American standard was just another dinner out among friends. And so, near the end of the meal, there was still food left on the buffet table, and a young man and a young woman who had been flirting with each other for about 10 days had this idea. that fit perfectly in their culture, with that extra food there on the table, they challenged each other to an eating contest. Seemed innocent enough, a competition almost familiar, to our American youth, but they forgot their perspective. They forgot the world they were in at that time. Some of those Haitian youth sitting at that table were eating more in that meal than their entire family would have eaten that day at home. And here were the American youth kind of making sport of the abundance that was before them. All too often over the centuries, scriptures have been interpreted from the perspective of the in-group that held wealth and power and status. After all of our Western culture, in all of it down in the last 2,000 years, Christianity has been the dominant religion, even here in the United States. And our way of understanding life and experiencing life certainly seems normal to us, and so it's easy to forget the context of others, especially the poor. Now, liberation theologians often worked with what they called base communities of people who had been oppressed by colonizers or left out of the normal channels of distribution of wealth. And when they sat down with them to study the Gospels and didn't bring all those writings from the dominant group, but actually told the stories together and listened to the interpretation of those base communities, these simple folks seemed to have a much deeper understanding of what Jesus was trying to say, of the mandates of our faith. And out of that movement came, in fact, a Catholic doctrine, a Roman Catholic doctrine, of the preferential option for the poor. Have y'all heard about that? Preferential option for the poor, wherein the Vatican even stated that God had a preferred option for poor people. As our lesson from James today says, has not God chosen the poor in the world to be rich in faith and to be heirs of the kingdom that he has promised to those who love him? Does that mean most of us are left out? For centuries, the poor were asked to be wise in the same way that those words from Proverbs we heard this morning would instruct, to seek not riches, but rather a good name, and to have a generous spirit. And I think almost superstitiously, the poor were offered a place in God's kingdom if they were just faithful through this rugged life, that after their death, they would live in heaven as preferred, servants of God. And the sort of backstory was, and all those rich people that have been oppressing you, they're going to go to hell. The rich were given their warnings. But the preachers in the churches, actually, if you read the book of Acts from the beginning, were always sort of tiptoeing because they depended often on wealthy donors. The warnings to the rich were sometimes soft-pedaled. One wonders if not to offend. But what if God did not give a whit whether one was rich or poor, but instead cared a lot about hearts? What if God invited everyone to the kind of generosity that created communities of justice, where all were beloved and all were fed and all were valued and no one was left out? What if our genuine love of brother and sister from all experiences, our relationship with brother and sister from all experiences, what if our encounters with neighbors and strangers, what if we were so overcome with gratitude for all that we had been given that we could not help but share with them. And what if, in situation after situation, those on the fringe, the powerless, felt empowered in our presence to speak up and to get their fair share for the necessities of life? That's what the Syro-Phoenician woman did in today's gospel in Mark. Don't forget that Jesus was just a good Jew, and he was becoming very popular. And a good Jew didn't speak to women, and certainly didn't, there were boundaries that just wouldn't be crossed, and especially wouldn't have spoken to a Gentile woman. And so her even hearing about Jesus and rushing to approach him, he was so popular, it would be almost like a beggar off the street who pushed his way into the White House at a state dinner to talk to the president. But she came in, deferential, bowing at his feet, and begged him to heal her daughter. And Jesus, almost thoughtlessly, tries to dismiss her, essentially calling her a dog. And she would have none of it. Standing on the principle that even dogs eat the crumbs of children, his indifference dissolved, and he healed her daughter. So what if all of our voices mattered, rich and poor? What if the voice that mattered most to all of us was the voice of God, asking us to pay attention, to know ourselves and our riches and privileges, to know our wealth, to know our neighbors, all of them, to know our circumstances, to know theirs, and then to act in accordance with these hearts that we have been given that are overflowing with gratitude? What if we acted not to try to get into heaven ourselves or stay out of hell, but to live in a heavenly way right here on earth, with joy and peace and wonder, connected in real ways to our brothers and sisters, all of them? It matters that we consider our perspective when we encounter these scriptures. Proverbs challenges us with the assumption that wealth, in and of itself, may be good, but isn't the whole story. Proverbs suggests that the poor are as valuable to God as the rich, and that we will all reap the results of our actions, and that there is judgment if we take advantage of the vulnerability of the poor. James calls us to love our neighbor as ourselves and to practice works of mercy. Make them habits of our hearts. And the gospel shows Jesus, although initially reticent, never failing to extend care and mercy to everyone. If we are going to call ourselves his followers, should we not be doing the same? Amen.